Most people think reaching $500,000 invested is the hard part. But what if I told you, this is actually where most people quietly destroy their future wealth without even realizing it, because there's a dangerous psychological trap that appears the moment your portfolio starts getting big. Suddenly you feel successful enough to relax, to upgrade your lifestyle, to take money out, to stop being as disciplined as you were in the beginning. And that one shift can quietly cost you millions of dollars over the next 20 years. Here's the scary part. At $500,000, your biggest enemy is no longer the market. It's you, your emotions, your impatience, your temptation to interrupt compounding right before it starts accelerating. Because most investors never make it to true financial freedom, not because they failed early, but because they slowed down too soon. And the strangest part, when you first hit $500,000, it still doesn't feel like wealth. You still work, you still stress, you still feel behind. But underneath the surface, something massive has already changed. Your money is beginning to work at the same speed you do. And if you understand what's happening at this stage, the next 10 years could completely change your life. Because the difference between someone who retires with $700,000 and someone who retires with $5 million often comes down to what they do right after reaching this point. There's a strange emotional shift that happens the moment your investment account crosses $500,000. Not excitement, not celebration, not even relief. It's something far quieter than that. Because when you first started investing, $500,000 sounded like the finish line. It sounded like the kind of number only wealthy people reached, the kind of money that would completely transform your life. But then one day you open your account, see the number sitting there, and realize something unexpected. Your life still looks almost the same. You still wake up to alarms. You still answer emails. You still go to work. You still think about bills, responsibilities, deadlines, taxes, and future uncertainty. And that's when a strange question begins forming in the back of your mind. If $500,000 still doesn't feel like freedom, what actually does? Because the truth is, reaching $500,000 creates one of the most misunderstood moments in wealth building. To people outside investing, it looks like you've already made it, but to the person who spent years building it, it often feels incomplete, like you climbed an enormous mountain only to discover another one waiting behind it. And that emotional contradiction confuses a lot of investors, because they expected the number itself to create peace. But wealth rarely feels dramatic while you're building it. Most of the time, it feels strangely normal. My name is Peter, and if you're somewhere near $500,000 or slowly building toward it, there's something extremely important you need to understand, because this stage of investing is where wealth creation quietly becomes something entirely different. Not because your strategy suddenly changes, not because you discovered some secret investment, but because the relationship between your time and your money begins shifting in a way most people never fully recognize. For years, almost everything depended on you, your discipline, your income, your sacrifices, your ability to keep investing while life constantly tempted you to spend more. You delayed gratification while other people upgraded their lives. You stayed consistent during market crashes. You kept buying when headlines sounded terrifying. You kept contributing when progress felt painfully slow. And for a very long time, your own effort was carrying almost the entire process. The first $50,000 probably felt impossibly slow. Every contribution seemed tiny. The market barely moved the account. You could invest for an entire year and still feel like nothing significant changed. Then came $100,000. That felt huge emotionally, but financially, your paycheck was still doing most of the work. Even at $200,000, the majority of progress still came from your savings rate. You were still the engine. But somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000, something subtle begins happening beneath the surface. Your money starts developing momentum of its own. And once that momentum begins, the entire psychology of investing changes. Let's make this real. Imagine you've built a $500,000 portfolio invested in broad market index funds. Let's assume a fairly normal long-term average return of around 8% annually. That portfolio now produces roughly $40,000 in growth every year on average. Think about that carefully. $40,000 without extra overtime, without asking for a raise, without changing careers, without starting another side hustle. Your investments alone are now producing the equivalent of a second income. That's the moment most investors fail to fully appreciate, because for the first time in your life, your money may be working nearly as hard as you are, and yet emotionally, it still doesn't feel dramatic. That's the strange part, because compounding almost never feels powerful while it's happening, at least not at first. Your portfolio grows from $500,000 to maybe $540,000, then $585,000, then perhaps $630,000. The numbers rise steadily, but nothing about it feels explosive. There are no fireworks, no cinematic breakthrough moments, just slow, quiet growth in the background of your life. And this is exactly why so many people sabotage themselves during this stage, because they mistake quiet progress for weak progress. They expect compounding to feel exciting, but real compounding feels boring for a very long time. In fact, the closer you get to serious wealth, the less dramatic it often feels emotionally. But mathematically, something extraordinary is happening, because compounding doesn't grow in straight lines. It grows in curves. At first the curve is almost invisible, then slowly it bends upward. Then eventually, the growth begins accelerating, so fast it becomes difficult to comprehend. The problem is most people interrupt the process before reaching that stage, and usually they interrupt it for perfectly understandable reasons. After years of discipline, reaching $500,000 creates a dangerous psychological illusion. You finally feel successful enough to relax your habits. You finally feel like you deserve the rewards you postponed for so long. A bigger house suddenly feels reasonable. A luxury car feels justified. Expensive vacations feel harmless. After all, you worked hard for this money, and technically, you can afford it. But what most investors fail to calculate is the future value of interrupted compounding, because at this level, every dollar removed from the system carries a hidden future cost. A $70,000 lifestyle upgrade doesn't just cost $70,000 left. Invested at 8% over 20 years, that same money could become more than $325,000. Single decision made in a moment of emotional reward can quietly erase hundreds of thousands of dollars of future momentum. And momentum is everything. That's the part wealthy investors understand better than almost anyone else. Building wealth isn't only about earning more money. Eventually it becomes about protecting momentum. Once the compounding engine gains speed, the smartest decision is often simply refusing to interrupt it. But interruptions don't only come from spending. Sometimes they come from fear. Imagine the market suddenly drops 30%. Your $500,000 portfolio becomes $350,000 almost overnight. That doesn't feel theoretical anymore. That feels deeply personal. Years of sacrifice appear to vanish in a matter of months, and suddenly your brain starts screaming at you to protect what's left. So you do what feels emotionally safe. You sell, you move to cash. You tell yourself you'll invest again when things calm down. But markets rarely wait for your emotions to recover. Historically, some of the strongest recovery periods happen when fear is still everywhere. By the time things finally feel safe again, prices have already risen. Your portfolio might have recovered back toward $500,000 if you had simply stayed invested, but instead, you remained on the sidelines, watching the recovery happen without you. That single emotional decision doesn't just cost money. It destroys continuity, and continuity is the entire secret behind compounding. Because compounding only works when growth remains uninterrupted. The chain must continue. Every year builds on the previous year. Every cycle stacks on top of the next one. Once you repeatedly interrupt the process, the timeline stretches dramatically longer. This is why long-term wealthy investors often look surprisingly boring from the outside. They don't constantly chase new strategies. They don't panic during downturns. They don't jump in and out of markets trying to predict the future. They simply remain consistent, while time does the heavy lifting. And time becomes incredibly powerful once your portfolio reaches this size. At smaller amounts, your income still dominates the equation. Early on, your salary mattered far more than investment returns. A raise could completely change your trajectory. But around $500,000, the balance begins shifting. Your portfolio itself becomes one of the most powerful financial tools in your life. Imagine receiving a $40,000 annual raise at work. Most people would consider that life-changing, but your portfolio may now generate similar growth entirely on its own during average market years. And the bigger the portfolio grows, the larger that invisible financial engine becomes. At $700,000, an 8% return becomes $56,000 annually. At $1 million, it becomes roughly $80,000. Suddenly, the growth itself begins, rivaling entire salaries, and that's the moment where wealth building truly changes psychologically, because eventually you realize your job is no longer the only thing building your future. Your capital has started participating in the process at a meaningful scale. Most people never emotionally adjust to this shift. They continue thinking like someone whose entire financial future depends only on earned income. Meanwhile, their investments quietly become more powerful year after year in the background. But here's another truth few people talk about. Reaching $500,000 doesn't only change your finances, it changes your relationship with time. Before investing, time often feels scarce. Every hour is traded for money. Your future depends entirely on your ability to continue working. But once your investments begin producing substantial growth, you start realizing something important. You are slowly purchasing freedom from future dependence on labor. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. That realization changes how you think about life. You become less desperate for quick wins, less emotional about temporary setbacks, less obsessed with keeping up with other people's lifestyles. Because for the first time, you can actually see the long-term machine working. And ironically, that's when patience becomes even more valuable. Because the years immediately after $500,000 are often the years when compounding accelerates the fastest. The larger the base becomes, the more dramatic future growth starts looking. At first, adding $50,000 to a portfolio felt impossible. Later, market fluctuations alone may move your account by that amount in weeks. That's when compounding starts feeling almost surreal. But most people never reach this stage because they underestimate how emotionally difficult consistency becomes after partial success. Discipline is hard when you have nothing. But strangely, discipline can become even harder once you finally have something substantial to lose. Fear increases, lifestyle temptation increases, emotional pressure increases, the stakes feel bigger, and this is where investors quietly separate into two completely different groups. The first group treats $500,000 like a reward. They begin slowing down, spending more, interrupting the process, pulling money out for upgrades that feel emotionally deserved. Their wealth growth gradually stalls. The second group treats $500,000 differently. They treat it like a machine that finally started working. Instead of interrupting it, they protect it. They stay invested. They keep contributing. They avoid unnecessary financial damage. And over the next 15 to 20 years, the gap between those two groups becomes enormous. Not because one group was smarter, not because one group earned dramatically more money, but because one group allowed compounding to continue uninterrupted, long enough for exponential growth to fully appear. And exponential growth changes everything. Eventually, something incredible begins happening. Your portfolio starts growing by amounts that once took you years to save manually. Early on, saving $25,000 may have required enormous discipline and sacrifice. Later, the market might move your portfolio by that amount in a single strong month. That's when you finally understand what compounding really is. It's not magic. It's not luck. It's accumulated momentum. The first phase of wealth building is incredibly difficult because you're pushing the boulder uphill manually. Every dollar requires effort. Every milestone feels slow. But eventually, the weight shifts. the momentum builds, and suddenly, the system begins helping itself move forward. That's why the middle years of investing are so important. Most people focus emotionally on the beginning, because starting feels hard. But the middle years are where fortunes are quietly built, not through dramatic actions, but through uninterrupted consistency. And here's something even more important. The investors who eventually build extraordinary wealth are rarely the most brilliant investors. Usually, they are simply the ones who avoided breaking the system. They stayed patient during fear. They stayed disciplined during success. They stayed invested during uncertainty. They resisted lifestyle inflation. They understood that protecting momentum mattered more than looking rich. Because real wealth often looks surprisingly ordinary while it's growing. The millionaire next door rarely feels wealthy while building wealth. Most of the journey feels repetitive, boring, quiet, automatic. The dramatic rewards usually appear much later than people expect. That's why social media creates such dangerous financial illusions. It convinces people wealth should look exciting immediately. Fancy cars, luxury lifestyles, visible success. But true long-term wealth creation usually looks far less glamorous in real time. It often looks like patience, like delayed gratification, like consistency repeated for decades, like staying invested while others panic, like protecting future freedom instead of purchasing short-term status. And eventually, those quiet decisions compound into something extraordinary. One day, your portfolio crosses $1 million, then maybe $2 million years later. And suddenly you realize something shocking. The majority of your wealth wasn't built during your hardest working years. It was built during the years when your investments quietly compounded in the background while you simply stayed out of the way. That realization changes how you see money forever, because wealth creation ultimately becomes less about intensity and more about duration, less about perfect timing and more about uninterrupted participation, less about brilliance and more about patience. And that's the lesson most people completely miss when they reach 500,000. They think the goal was reaching the number itself, but the number was never the real goal. The real goal was reaching the stage where compounding finally becomes powerful enough to transform time into leverage. Because once your investments begin consistently growing on their own, the entire relationship between effort and money changes forever. Your future stops depending entirely on how hard you can work. Your money starts sharing the workload. Your capital starts building momentum faster than your labor ever could. And if you protect that momentum long enough, something remarkable eventually happens. Wealth stops feeling impossible, not because you discovered a shortcut, not because you got lucky, but because you finally stayed in the game long enough for compounding to fully reveal what it can do. So if you're somewhere on the path toward $500,000, remember this. The biggest mistake isn't moving too slowly. The biggest mistake is interrupting the process just before the acceleration begins. Because the real power of investing doesn't come from dramatic moments. It comes from uninterrupted years. Years of consistency. Years of patience. Years of allowing time to quietly multiply what you already built. And one day, when your portfolio grows more in a year than you once earned working full-time, you'll realize something surprising. Financial freedom wasn't created in a single breakthrough moment. It was built quietly, invisibly, year after year, while compounding worked silently in the background the entire time. And for many investors, that silent transformation truly begins around $500,000.